Shalom, everyone. It's good to see you. We're back here for episode 4, Daniel chapter 3. So, again, I'm a teacher. So, again, we're not going to follow Daniel right away. I want to give you some previous information. I want you to turn in your Bibles to the book of 2 Kings. 2 Kings. And you're going to go to chapter number 20. I'll give you a lot of information around it, but I want you to understand where all the gold came from that we're going to be dealing with tonight. In chapter 20, Hezekiah has just invited the ambassador from Babylonia over to visit, because the king of Babylonia at that time, Baladan, had sent him a letter. And the letter congratulated him and spoke kindly of his God. And so he invited the ambassador in. Well, it's not just a meal that Hezekiah gave this ambassador, but he gave him a tour. And if you look at verse number 15 in chapter 20, you will see that it says, and he said, "What did they say, or what did they see in your house?" Hezekiah said, "They saw everything in my house. There was nothing that I did not show them in my treasuries." In my treasuries. Not only his house, he showed them God's house. And he showed them the treasuries in God's house. Now, the treasuries in God's house had just recently filled up, meaning we're going to have to go back again even further. And I want to go back to the days of Sennacherib. Sennacherib was the king of Assyria. Sennacherib had a mighty, mighty army. In fact, his army was huge. In fact, many would compare it to the army of Gog and Magog. And they would tell you that this actually could have been, had Hezekiah done the right things, this could have been the day that the world to come would have come, because Hezekiah would have been declared the Messiah. But that didn't happen, so we're going to have to continue life as it is. Sennacherib had problems with two nations, the Jewish nation and Babylon. Baladan and the Chaldeans had fought continuous wars with the Assyrians. The Assyrians have even destroyed many of the cities, but it still didn't help. The Babylonians and the Chaldeans continued to fight. In fact, they enlisted Israel into the fight, and Israel quit paying tribute. Sennacherib, when we see him in the book of Kings, this is his second siege on the city of Jerusalem. He had sieged the city approximately 14 years earlier, at which time he took all the gold that was in the temple, or in Hezekiah's palace, and they even took the gold off the doors of the temple in order to meet his demands for a tariff. And that would continue every year until finally he said enough was enough, and that's when he decided to join the rebellion. At that point, Sennacherib gathered his army to attack. Now, I've only found one place in my readings that I can actually say gave me some understanding of how large an army he actually had. Now, we'll know that at the end, 285,000 Assyrian soldiers will die. But he had more than the Assyrian army. He had the armies of Media Persia. He had all of the armies to the north of him, all the way through Turkey. The size of his army, according to one story, was 45,000 princes on gold and silver chariots, 80,000 knights, 60,000 swordsmen, 2,500,000 cavalry troops, and foot soldiers. Can you imagine the size of his army? He took his army into Israel, and he began through Judah because the northern kingdom had already been demolished. There was no longer a northern kingdom, and the people in the north had already been banished. He began to annihilate all the cities surrounding Jerusalem. The last city that he would take would be the city of Lachish, and then he would come to Jerusalem. During that time, he would slaughter hundreds of thousands of people. He took 200,000 into captivity, according to the records. He was not a nice man. After finishing at Lachish, he brought his army down to Israel, or to Jerusalem, and he set them on three sides of the city, and they began to prepare the siege of the city. But he wasn't satisfied with just sieging the city this time. He wanted to destroy it. That was his goal. Well, the same period of time, Hezekiah, remember the story? Hezekiah was visited by Isaiah. Remember, Isaiah came to him because of the fact that, well, he refused to marry. He understood that if he married, his son would become the most evil king in the kingdom, or its ever history. So he refused to get married, in which Isaiah told him, you have 3 days and then you will die. So according to the story, he turns his face to the wall, and you can remember this in Isaiah 37, turned his face to the wall and began to pray. When he finished his prayers, the city is under siege. He's laying in his deathbed, and we begin to find a series of miracles that are going to happen. Hezekiah agrees to marry, and he'll end up marrying Isaiah's daughter. At the same point in time as he is healed, we find that there is a prophecy made in Isaiah 37 regarding the siege that's on the outside, in which God will tell him, not one bow shot will come against this city. Not one soldier will touch the walls. Well, that night, strange, lo and behold, a plague entered into the camp of the Assyrians. Some say it was a plague of infested mice and rats. Others simply say it was simply the hand of God and the angel of death that passed over the camp. But understand, only 285,000 Assyrians died, not the entire army of several million. That army simply dispersed and all went home. Sennacherib went home, and he began to plot the next invasion of Jerusalem because he was going to destroy that city. So he went into his temple. The temple's called Nisroch, and he was there before his god, whose god's name was Nesser. Well, the word Nesser means a beam. The god he was going before was part of the ark that Noah used to go across the seas. And it had now ended up in his place, and it became a shrine in which it became a god. Well, while he was praying to his god, he offered his two of his three sons, to his god if he would allow him to win. Well, the two sons heard him, and later on they will end up stabbing him while he's bowed before his god. Then they will exit quickly from the community. All of this happens with the plagues and with the destruction of the city on Passover. On Passover. Two great events happened on Passover. The first one was in Egypt, and this is the second great one. Now, after all of this is said and done, the whole miracle had reached the ears of our king from Babylonia. And one of the things that happened in that discussions was a letter was sent. Now, he sent it by his personal scribe. His scribe's name was Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar inherited the kingdom not because he was related to anybody, but through intrigue. He eliminated the other heirs and he became king. But before he did that, he wrote the letter in which he told the king, you need to be more positive in the letter. And so he rewrote the letter. God found favor in Nebuchadnezzar from that writing. And so Nebuchadnezzar will eventually become the king. So now we have the story of Nebuchadnezzar, but we also have the Sennacherib story. Remember, the treasuries were emptied by Sennacherib during the first. Now, how did he refill all those treasuries in such a short period of time? Well, the answer was Sennacherib's men left everything and went home. The booty in the city became unbelievable. Now, this is on top of what was already going on in Israel, because you see, in Israel at that time, it was considered the golden age. Why was it the golden age if they're under persecution? Because Hezekiah made every man, woman, and child to learn the Torah, to learn the 613 laws. In fact, they became so enthusiastic over learning the 613 laws, many of them barely made an income because they chose to study instead of work, and only worked when they needed the money in order to supply food for their house. Imagine that. So now we find that the city is now filled with gold. Nebuchadnezzar now comes and raids the city, and he besieges the city, but he does not destroy the city with that first attack. You see, Nebuchadnezzar was afraid of God. In fact, he wouldn't even go on this first invasion. He sent his generals, and he went to Turkey to gather more land. So when they arrived, there was an agreement made with Jehoiakim, who is now king. And Jehoiakim gave them gold and silver and 10,000 of their brightest. And that was Daniel's group. Now we've gone through the period in time that we're talking about. We've gone through the idea of the idol, or at least gone through the statue, the image. Now here in this next chapter, we're going to find out some other interesting things. And again, it's not complete. There's things that are kind of missing, but we'll get into that as we go along. So I want you to turn to Daniel, and I want you to look at chapter 3. And we will stop at the end of the first verse because we need to understand something else geographically. First off, it says, the king Nebuchadnezzar made a statue of gold. Its height was 60 cubits, which would be about 90 feet. Its width would be 6 cubits, or about 9 feet. So imagine this structure, 90 feet tall and only 9 feet wide. Problem: the statue is not stationary, not safe, because you remember, where are they? They're on sand. They're in the valley. And so what will have to happen is that they're going to have to use a platform underneath it. Well, we know that the entire statue is gold. So the next question comes, what's the platform going to look like? And for Nebuchadnezzar, his idol only needed one thing: more gold. So what was it built with? All the gold that he had brought back from the invasion with Jehoiakim. That became the gold used for the platform. Now, it also goes on to say at this point, he stood it in the plain of Dura. Well, the word Dura means plain, but Dura is also another location that should give us some information, because you see, it goes back to the book of Genesis. The Tower of Babel was built in the plain of Dura. So what we're looking at then is an object that is built in a place near where the Tower of Babel stood. So we're getting some context for where this is all happening. Before we go
You muted yourself.
There I go. Thank you. Chapter 37, I want you to look at verse 1. The hand of Hashem was upon me. It took me out by my spirit of Hashem and set me down in the midst of the valley. According to the rabbis and the sages, the valley that he put him down into was Dura. We're going to have two events going on simultaneously in that same valley. We're going to have the event that's occurring with the statue, and we'll have the event that's occurring with Ezekiel. Both will happen at the same time. Both will happen at the same time. Now, back to our story. Verse 2. Then the king Nebuchadnezzar assembled, and there's a list of all of the different offices, and my Bible doesn't it creates its own list of names because nobody really knows some of the names that are there. They were officials, and they all came to the dedication of the statue or the dedication of the image. It's called a statue here. Some places it's going to be called an image. Well, what's the difference between a statue and an image? What's the difference? Scholars say that a statue is just simply that. It would be like going to New York and seeing the Statue of Liberty. It's a statue. Others will tell you, no, it's an image. And the question will then become, an image of what? Was it going to be an image that was a being, a male, 90 feet tall? Was the image going to be Nebuchadnezzar's image? Was the image going to be Nebuchadnezzar's god, Belshazzar? What was the image going to be? Now, if it's only a statue, nobody would have had to bow down because it's a statue. If it's an image, that's what we're trying to identify and break out of the story. Verse 3, thereupon the rulers, the nobles, the governors, the judges, the treasurers, the advisors, the guards, and all the provincial officials gathered together for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar, again, see, it's a statue, had put up. And they sat facing the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. A herald cried aloud, it commanded to you, peoples, nations, languages, when you hear the sound of the horn, the whistle, the tambourine, the drum, the cymbals, the flute, and all the kinds of musical instruments, that shall fall and prostrate yourselves to the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Okay. All you would need to do is blow a horn. But that's not what's there. So I want you to use your sanctified imaginations for a second. Why are all those instruments there to play a single note? Was this simply a matter of everybody arriving, all of you now will bow down at the sound? Or was this, in fact, simply a gathering of all the nations that are underneath Nebuchadnezzar's control? And was it more like a dinner, a celebration? Because many would have come for the unveiling of a statue. Is that what was actually going on? Or was it simply about one note and everybody was standing there? Well, we know that later on we're going to find in chapter number 5, we're going to find the story of Belshazzar, in which he's had a feast going on for months. So feasts are not uncommon. Celebrations were not uncommon. This, I think, originally was to be a celebration. But the course of the celebration would change. It's not what it was. That's when it became an image. If you look at verse number 7, Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the whistle, the tambourine, the drum, the cymbals, and all the musical instruments, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell and prostrated themselves to the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Thereupon, at that very time, some Chaldean men came forth and defamed the Jews. Okay. How did the Chaldean men know that the three had not bowed down? The word for defame is also the word that we would use for to speak about somebody else behind their back. In other words, there may have been truth. All they knew is the fact that the rumor had it that these guys didn't bow down. It was the rumor that they had. They were right. In fact, the three men will actually agree to that. But in the beginning, nobody saw it. Nobody understood what was going on. But all of a sudden, everybody was to bow. Now, there's parts of the story that are not here. First off, where's Daniel? Why wasn't Daniel there? Isn't that what this book is about? Well, again, suppositions. Some would tell us that he was there. But remember, how did Nebuchadnezzar look at Daniel? When he saw Daniel, he saw what? A god. Should a god have to bow to another god? That was the simple question. Others say, no, he wouldn't have been there, because even so, he would have had to have been on the dais, and obviously Nebuchadnezzar would have had to deal with that. Some say that Nebuchadnezzar had actually sent him out of town. Different places all around. Nobody knows for certain where it was that he actually went to. Some said it was Tiberias along the Sea of Galilee, that he was organizing some sort of water and doing those kinds of things. And that later, that's where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, our three Jews, will end up. But nobody's certain. But now we have to also remember, these three didn't bow down, but the question is, why didn't they bow down? What were they missing? What were they missing? Now, if we look at verse 9, we'll keep reading and then see if that'll help us out. They explained and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, may the king live forever. O king, issue a decree that every person who hears the sound of the horn, the whistle, the tambourine, the drum, the cymbals, the flute, and all the musical instruments fall and prostrate himself to the golden statue. Wait a second. Who decided that everybody had to bow to the statue? Was it Nebuchadnezzar? Or was it these Chaldeans? What brought them to that point? And whoever does not bow and prostrate himself is to be thrown into the fiery burning furnace. There are Jewish men whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men have not accepted your decree upon themselves. Now, the question is, was it his decree, or was it a decree that came about because of the Chaldeans? O king, your God, they do not worship. But again, interesting enough, every god was acceptable in Babylon, just like every god would be acceptable in Medo-Persia, the next kingdom. So this is something that's going to be specially placed upon this image that all of a sudden now has become a lightning rod for obedience and disobedience. And notice the last part. And to the golden statue that you have set up, they do not prostrate themselves. Okay, we have reached the point then. We haven't found our answers to some of the questions that are coming up. One, How did they know that they were going to have to bow to this? How did they know that? One thing we're going to have to understand is that in the Bible, there is no such thing as chronological order. The men first came to King Nebuchadnezzar and created the need for this particular thing to happen. The same thing is going to happen later on when Daniel finds himself in a situation of praying in his room. You remember that? But let's go back to where we're at. We're in the plain of Dura. What also was in the plain of Dura? That was this Tower of Babel. If we go all the way back to the book of Genesis, there was another incident very similar to this, in which the king wanted everyone to receive him as a god. But there was one man who would not accept that. Do you remember who that was? Abraham. Abraham refused to bow to the god of Nimrod. Time out. What was the punishment that was given to Abraham at that point in time? What was his punishment? The fiery furnace. The fiery furnace. Are we reliving a story that's already happened? Is that where we're going with this? Now think about this for a second. We now have 3 Hebrew kids who understand that there's going to be this move. How are they going to deal with that? What are they going to do? Well, the first thing that they do, since they're not prophets, they go to their teacher, for lack of a better word. Who is their teacher? Daniel. And Daniel tells them what? Go find Ezekiel. So the 3 march off out into the river area along the deltas, and they find Elijah or Ezekiel. And at that point in time, what happens next? Ezekiel, we need help. This is what's going to happen. What should we do? What should we do? Ezekiel hears their story. He walks into a corner and he begins to pray. He comes back to them and says, it's up to you, but if I were you, I would run. I wouldn't stay. And if you do stay and you do get caught, God will not protect you. So it's not like the Abraham story, but it will be. Because God simply said that, but that was not what he would intend to do, because we know he changed his mind. But there's something else that's going on here. They return to their house and they're still with the same dilemma. Should we or shouldn't we? What are we going to do? Well, it's at that point in time that they decide we're not going to bow. What inspired them not to bow, knowing that they're going to be put into a fiery furnace? The answer? Exodus chapter 7. The plague of the frogs. Do you remember the plague of the frogs? The frogs came out of the water and they filled the land everywhere, including the furnaces, including the fire. God put them through the fire. Why should we be any different? And so the 3 went to this meeting with the resolve, whether God saves us or not, makes no difference. We, like the frogs, will behave according to God. That will be our point. And so they begin to think about it from an entirely different perspective. Now look what's going on. We're all gathered here. We've resolved that we're not going to bow down. They've resolved that there's going to be punishment for the Jews. Well, why did they want those Jews punished? Well, remind yourself, they took positions in Babylon. The Chaldeans were out positions because these three were given special privileges that they shouldn't have been given. Well, at least that's what they thought. So we begin to see our story change a little bit. Let's go on down a little bit further. Go down to 16. We'll skip some. You already know what's going to happen. Nebuchadnezzar's going to get mad. He's going to give them one more chance. They're going to say no. And in verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego responded and said to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we are not worried about replying to you about this matter. Behold, our God, whom we worship, is able to save us. He will rescue us from the fire, the burning furnace, and from your hand, O king. But if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not worship your God, and to the golden statue that you have set up, we shall not prostrate ourselves. They've already determined that they're not going to bow down to this image that he's created for them. And whether God chooses to save them or not is beside the point. Now, the furnace was used to destroy the enemies of the Babylonians and in the days of Nimrod. Why did they choose that? Well, first off, there were plenty of kilns because all their buildings were made from the brick that they created out of the ground. Plus the fact that if you're a rebellious person, there is no burial for you. There is no ashes. There's nothing left over. You become part of the furnace. And that's the end of it. No stories, no history, nothing. It's just done. But in spite that, we plan to do what God has wanted us to do. We will not worship you. We will only worship him. Again, Nebuchadnezzar's angry, more angry than he was before. Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and from the form of his face became contorted as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He exclaimed and commanded that his men to heat the furnace to 7 times more than it normally heated. Well, then they commanded strong men of guards to go with them, take them up to the top of the hill, up to the top. Because you see, the furnace itself was out of the ground. There was the bottom where the bricks were kilned and they could take it out. But at the top where it was inserted, that's the place where they were thrown in. Now, Nebuchadnezzar must have been sitting somewhere where he could see some of what was going on. We're not sure how that looked, but we know that he actually saw something, or at least he said he saw something. So as he gets to the top with these strong guards, what happened to the guards? The guards fainted or died from heat exhaustion, and the 3 stumbled into the fiery furnace. But they didn't die when they went into the furnace, because we say that they found themselves in there with a 4th man. God intended to save them. Now the question was, how was he going to save them? Well, God has angels. Angels have specific jobs. One angel's job was to be in charge of hail, sleet, ice. He suggested that he be sent down and then he would just simply cool off the furnace. But there was another angel who was in charge of fire. That angel said, why should we do that? That takes away from the miracle. Let me go down. I will cool the inside of the furnace, but I will heat the outside. Even hotter than it already was. And it was 7 times hotter than necessary. And so that's what happened. Oh, by the way, that angel's name was Gabriel. Gabriel was the angel. So Gabriel goes down into the furnace and he walks with them within the furnace. Now, as they're walking around in the furnace, what's going on the outside is it's becoming hotter and hotter. According to the Midrashic writings, Even Nebuchadnezzar is burned by the heat of that fire. He will now display scars after it's all said and done. The apparent change will not be inside the furnace, it'll be outside. When it's all said and done, according to this, 4 nations actually are destroyed. Well, actually not 4 nations, but the leaders from 4 of those nations are destroyed along with it. The fire is so hot that is burning them in and on the outside of the fire, not just what's going on inside. Quite a miracle. Now, at the same point in time, while this is all going on, something else begins to happen. You see, a wind begins to blow. The wind becomes so strong that it knocks the statue over. 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide, with a huge platform underneath it, but the wind was strong enough to knock it over. And then the question comes, why did the wind knock it over? But we have to remember what else was going on in the Valley of Dura that night. Ezekiel chapter 37. A wind was blowing in that valley. And what was happening by that wind? The bones were beginning to gather. All of a sudden, we created human beings. Now, some would say that that's just a story that goes along with it. It's not true. But I wonder. Remember, Ezekiel went there by a dream, a vision. In fact, it grabbed him by the hair and pulled him there. So we've got all of these things going on in the same valley, the Valley of Dura. That's what's happening in this particular valley. Now, as the story goes on, as we read further, I want you to go down to verse number 26. Seeing that the 4 men are now loose and running around, it says, Then Nebuchadnezzar approached the opening of the fiery burning furnace. He exclaimed and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the supreme God, step out and come here. Step out of this furnace and come here. Thereupon Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. The satraps, the nobles, all of those that were assembled around, whose bodies the fire had no effect on them, their hair was not singed at all, and whose cloaks were unaltered, and who had not absorbed the smell. But not could be said the same for those that were around that fiery furnace. They had been singed, they had been burned, their clothes had been tattered because of what's going on. So Nebuchadnezzar explained and said, Blessed is the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Blessed is the God. What's going on in his being is a change that's coming in him. It's not an immediate change, but it's the beginnings of an inkling. We're never told whatever happened to Nebuchadnezzar. How did he die? Many of the writings suggested that he died of natural causes, that he died in peace and comfort. That was how he died. Not what we would have normally thought of from somebody who was as evil as he was in the very beginnings of this whole story. As you go through the reading, I want you to go over to verse number 31. From King Nebuchadnezzar to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwelt throughout the earth, may your peace be abundant. It behooves me to let the sign or signs and the wonders that the supreme God has performed for me. How great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is for all generations. Sign or signs? Sign or signs? Oh, by the way, this is written in the first person. But remember, the verses before it are written in the third person. You see, there's going to be a change, and according to the rabbis and the sages, the commentators, this should really be attached to chapter 4, because this is what was the result of the signs that are going to be given. But understand, first off, the 3 did not die in the furnace. They were protected. Not only were they protected, but there was a strong wind which took out the statue. There was also the idea of everything going on. Oh, by the way, I forgot one thing. When did all this happen? Rosh Hashanah. This happened on Tishri 1. When did Ezekiel 37 supposedly occur? Rosh Hashanah, Tishri 1. The events of Ezekiel and the events of Daniel, because Daniel and Ezekiel were both taken at the same time by Nebuchadnezzar's men. Daniel was put into the capital city, while Ezekiel had to live down along the river, which we talked about in going along with Psalm 137. God is in control of all things. Nothing is outside his hand. Nebuchadnezzar thought that he was invincible because God was in heaven and he was on earth. How many people think they can get away with whatever they want to get away with because God isn't here? He's only in heaven. That's the story that the Jewish people would like you to understand. God is not just in heaven. God is everywhere. I think I gave you enough to think about. Pretty sure I did. So I'm going to let it go at that. We've gone 45 minutes. Does anybody have any thoughts? I know Mike's reading my commentary, Ezekiel or Daniel, which I have got. That was the first commentary that I ever got. It came by way of Art Scroll. In fact, that's the first Art Scroll book commentary that Art Scroll made. He made it originally for Jewish people who didn't know their culture and heritage. What he's found out, or what Art Scroll has found out, is more Gentiles have read their books, than Jews. We're more curious, I guess. But anyway, it's a very good book. And like I said, much of what I taught came from there. The rest of it that I'm teaching you came from this. This is called the Sanhedrin. This is one of the books of the Talmud. If you go to section 94b, you'll find the story in here. It won't be that easy to find because it's broken up into sections. The Talmud is not meant to be read by everybody. In fact, the first book I got regarding the Talmud to help me learn is called Swimming in the Sea of the Talmud. In other words, if you can swim in the sea, you don't drown. But it's a long swim. So anyway, but it's from the Talmud, and it's Talmud 94b. And there's 2 pages of 94b. It's really the second 94b, page 2, that you're going to find most of what I've been talking about. Okay. I keep saying I'm done. I'm done. Anybody have any thoughts?